Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome in the Moravian Gallery in Brno, where we are hosting a symposium called Jindřich Chalupecký in the Word. My name is Tereza Jindrova, and I am the curator of Jindřich Chalupecký Society. Jindřich Chalupecký Society is a platform for contemporary Czech art and is organizing Jindřich Chalupecký Award for young visual artists. But who is the man whose name the organization and the award bear? Jindřich Chalupecký was an art critic, theorist, and curator, and undoubtedly he was also one of the most significant figures of contemporary art in Czechoslovakia.
Relations. He definitely had. He was believed to be someone who is well informed. He had an aura of well-connected expert, someone who was in touch with people around the world. And that was not just a myth, but definitely true, even that also this reputation had its history that I will briefly outline. First, Jindřich Chalupecký might be described as an outsider in international relations, especially in 1930s and 1940s, when he traveled, but he was not as well connected as some other exponents of Czech interwar avant-garde. And he was maybe on a position of an outsider in a connection with them. This changed after the Second World War, when the brief period of 1945-1948, Jindřich Chalupecký was very much active in art and state administration of its time, when he was part of different artists' unions, but also involved with the state administration, traveled, was meeting people abroad. We can also say that he had a certain power over Czechoslovak culture at that time, and this was a time period when he established some of his contacts that he would later on develop. But after 1948, he was pushed aside, but also stepped aside as well. One of the reasons was that he was seen by the new political regime as a cosmopolitan element, someone who was maybe putting too much emphasis on art that was not a local one. A very different position Jindřich Chalupecký achieved in 1960s, where when after the period of 1950s, when he could not travel abroad or on a very limited base, he starts to travel. The first time he was able to visit exhibitions of Western post-war art was in 1958 in Brussels, and then in 1960s he starts to travel around Europe, into Paris, Italy, but also to Soviet Union. He became active in ICA, the International Organization for Art Critics. He was well acquainted with journals and books on art, and he was able to mediate what he learned abroad or what he read in those journals and books for local audience. So at this period of time we can find Chalupecký's articles in Czech journals explaining what is the state of contemporary art in the world. At the same time, Jindřich Chalupecký was building a huge network of people he exchanged letters with. Most of these people he found or contacted in 1960s, and it was literally hundreds of people he exchanged letters with. He was very lucky and successful in being able to find very, very interesting, progressive art historians, curators, artists that he tried to keep a relationship for the future. So at home, Jindřich Chalupecký was acting as an expert on international contemporary art, which, for example, we can see in his book Art Today, where he collected some of his previous articles and was trying to offer a picture of contemporary art in the world of that very time. And just very briefly to show how he saw the state of international contemporary art in 1960s, he was far from being uncritical to it. He was seeing and showing that this art was testing its limits and sort of is trying to find ways to change itself. But what he was not impressed with was this need to look for new formal solutions, and he maybe missed the emphasis on social issues. He saw that there is no more avant-garde, that the art world of 1960s become maybe too market-driven, and if not, these were the artists that were maybe in a cultural underground. And he saw that there was a difficulty for serious art in the art world of Western Europe and the world to be relevant, to have the power to be something more than just a game or a product within the art market, but to offer something more. At the same time, in 1960s, Jindřich Chalupecký served as an expert on Czechoslovak and Eastern European art when he was trying to organize exhibitions of Czechoslovak art abroad. We will hear about some examples in the presentations that will follow, and also was writing reports on art from Czechoslovakia and other Eastern European countries for journals that were published in Western Europe as Studio International, Flash Art, and the others. He saw the way how he described art in Czechoslovakia was the view that saw the huge discontinuity of local Czech art when the Czech art was detached from its own past, but also the international scene. On the other hand, he could see that there were certain styles that we can see in contemporary art world elsewhere, present also in Czechoslovakia, but he saw them not as derivative, but somehow these styles or languages were rediscovered locally in Czechoslovakia. But still, he saw Czech art as fundamentally different, somehow withdrawn, introvert, an art that was very individualistic. And the reason for these characteristics was that there was a prevailing difficulty to show work. There was very few possibilities to show this art abroad, but also the interest from the abroad was very small. Yet Chalupecký saw this as a reason why Czech art is free, in fact, because there are no institutions to limit it. There was no art market, no gallerists, no critical system that would interfere with the will of the artists. So this art was very private but very authentic, based on ethical qualities rather than the formal ones. We can almost describe it as some sort of a secret religion with limited agencies. So if we are to look at the sources of Jindřich Chalupecký's authority, why he was so respected. In Czechoslovakia, he was respected as someone with an international outreach, and outside Czechoslovakia, he was clearly viewed as a valuable source of otherwise unavailable information. And we can also see that without support of Czechoslovak art institutions and without possibility to travel, which is something that to Jindřich Chalupecký happened after 1970s, the possibility to promote art from Czechoslovakia was more and more difficult. He had many contacts, but he could not guarantee an exhibitions or articles for the Czech artists. It was more and more difficult for him to publish his texts in Western magazines. On the other hand, still in 1970s and 1980s, he would write texts, this time published in Samizdat for Czechoslovak public, explaining some tendencies in Western art. And he saw the Western art as an art in crisis, art that is looking for its meaning. On the other hand, he saw Czech art as art that found its meaning amidst this isolation and suppression. And it was to carry on these missions of free artists, although they were stripped from its audience. And in this both missions, for the inside and for the outside, I found Jindřich Chalupecký trying to explain something that it's not explainable. It was difficult to understand for local art community in Czechoslovakia to understand Western art, and it was quite difficult to explain Czech art to representatives of international art, because it was, according to Jindřich Chalupecký, quite isolated and difficult to penetrate. So if we will go back to the beginning and to see this recommendations and needs that Jindřich Chalupecký attached to contemporary art, we can see that it in almost all cases it failed, that social value of art, both in capitalist and socialist society, was dubious, definitely from his point of view in 1970s. The justification of art is something that is an ongoing process, something that cannot be finished or achieved. The art in modern society is as helpless as religion of the past. It cannot provide, or it is not a tool to change the world. And art can have certain agencies, but cannot influence general audience or change the world of general audiences, both in socialist countries of the time and in the western part of the Europe. So this was a very generalizing presentation, and I hope that in future presentations we will see case studies that will prove or contradict what I just said. Thank you.
Thanks to Tomáš for this very important introduction into the general theme of our today's symposium. We will get back to the contacts of Chalupecký in abroad, more specifically in the second half of today's program. But now let me welcome Eva Astakovska, an art scholar, critic and curator of the Latvian Center for Contemporary Art, where she leads researches about art in the Soviet and post-Soviet period. Eva will talk about Valdis Aboliņš, Latvian art critic, and his legacy in the context of Western-Eastern relationships during the Cold War.
Hello, my name is Eva Astakovska. I'm curator and researcher from Riga. And in my presentation, I would like to introduce you to Valdis Aboliņš and his creative work and legacy in context of cultural relations between West and East during Cold War period. In this symposium that reflects on legacy of Jindřich Chalupecký and similar personalities in Central and Eastern European art, the context of Valdis Aboliņš work may seem very different. Yet introducing his work in the symposium may add to understanding how complex and diverse were the artistic and cultural scenes and their strategies in our countries during Cold War period, and how important it is to apply transnational and comparative perspective to the research of this past. And here I will start to share some images. Valdis Aboliņš was not an art critic, but rather self-taught art curator and male artist, a Latvian emigre in West Germany, whose most active years of intellectual and creative work were 1960s and 70s, and who was strongly influenced by the political upheaval and events in 1968 in both sides of Iron Curtain. He had published only a few reviews in the printed press, but he had written a lot, and his most relevant writings were his mail art and letters that not only introduced to his intellectual legacy, but also on his role in stimulating events, processes, and flow and exchange of information in the Cold War era, in tying together the separated narratives of the Western and Eastern blocs, and offering a chance to see the Cold War era life not only in confrontations, but also in relationships and contacts. There are a number of similarities in Chalupecký's and Aboliņš personalities and work, like passionate interest in avant-garde art, selfless support for young artists, and engagement in fostering international cultural relations. But there are also fundamental differences between these two figures, especially in terms of their political positions and beliefs. One of the major principles for Valdis Aboliņš was, and I quote him here, culture as politics, without distinguishing between the two. This principle evolved from his engagement in the Western New Left movement. Another difference from Chalupecký is that Abolin's role in the history of Latvian art yet has to be assessed. Even today, he is relatively unknown personality who only slowly gets its recognition. And just in 2019, we at the Latvian Center for Contemporary Art have published an extensive monographic study on him. One of the reasons of this neglect is that this legacy is not a convenient or uneasily understood topic in the dominant narrative of non-conformism and as nationalism and anti-Soviet dissidentism. Valdis Abolinš belonged to the intellectual wing of the New Left in the West, focusing on critique of capitalism and idealistic vision of its alternative, as he was describing an improved model of socialism which could be developed by analyzing the inherent contradictions in the leftist system. Recently, a number of researchers in Central and Eastern Europe are addressing previously overlooked questions, such as aspects of dissent associated with political left and intellectual traditions such as Marxist humanism, reform communism, and the New Left that critically reflected on the state socialism and the relevance on this intellectual legacy today. These researchers are putting attention on exploring in which ways New Left politics, defined broadly, and countercultural affinities were channeled by artists, filmmakers, writers, and others in Eastern Europe in the 60s and 70s. How was Marxist thinking used to shape new critiques of power in societies where Marxist-Leninism was a matter of doctrine? This research on Valdis Abolinš is also a part of this revisited past, and his legacy can be seen as a source of inspiration for those who are seeking ways out of today's political and economical crisis. To understand the context and trajectory of his work, I'll briefly introduce with the most relevant biographical facts about Valdis Abolinš. He was born in Latvia in 1939, and in 1944, just before the Soviet Union occupied Latvia for the second time, his family escaped to the West Germany and stayed in displaced persons camps until the beginning of the 50s and then settled in Cologne. In early 60s, he began architecture studies at Aachen University, and still being architecture student, he organized experimental theater and multidisciplinary performances, concerts of then very unknown electronic music and free jazz and poetry readings. The most visible event was the Fluxus Festival of New Art on 20th July 1964. For that time, one of the most politicized avant-garde events in post-war Europe, with the participation of artists who later became the stars of German political art like Watson Brock, Wolf Stel, and Joseph Beuys. He organized also many other artistic and musical events of 60s avant-garde, for instance, Namjoon Pike, musical concerts, the Living Theater, Günter Bruce performances. For a few years, he was running the Gallery of Aachen, this radical avant-garde program, presenting the work by then yet unknown artists like Jörg Immendorf, Franz Erhard Walter, John Letham, Dick Higgins, Alison Knowles, and others. In parallel to that, he also wrote unorthodox reviews, untranslated poetry, discussed the newest literature and music, and made provocative actions himself. After the gallery was closed in 1967, Valdis Abolinš admitted that it conceded with his subjective doubts about the political significance of art, an awareness that under developed capitalism, with developed commodity relations, art has not the slightest critical chance against the existing situation in the society. For a few years, he distanced himself from the art curating, and although he was still interested in avant-garde art and the newest forms of art, he criticized them as being too dependent from the art market and alienated from the public. 1968 and the Prague Spring for Valdis Āboliņš was the moment when, combining his Western leftist ideas and his Latvian exile identity, he became much more political. Like many other young people in the West, Āboliņš identified himself with the ideas of the New Left and Marxism, but he hybridized the concept of global struggle between capitalism and socialism with the issues of relations with Latvia. Unlike many other politically active exiles, he insisted that there is need for solidary relations with Latvia and thus also official contact with its authorities and functionaries, discussing and publicly confronting them with the contradictions and shortcomings of the system. His convictions were interwoven with leftist sympathies and criticism of the actual socialist system. Although he was critical about the Soviet regime, he opted for tactics of cooperation and hoped to bring in practice the theory-based conviction about an improved socialist culture as an alternative to capitalism. Political culture and also political art for him was a way to do it. The leftism of Valdis Āboliņš drew on Marx's early ideas on ideology and his critical analysis of culture. Āboliņš hybridized the Western Marxist thesis on the necessity to renounce erroneous notions and illusions created by ideologies and the concept of the global struggle between capitalism and socialism with issues of relations to Latvia. He was studying early 20th century theorists of Marxism, psychoanalysis, and anti-authoritarian pedagogy like Wilhelm Reich, like works of Wilhelm Reich, Walter Benjamin, and through him also Latvian theater director Asja Lācis. But the most important ones were Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, who, through their analysis of ideologies, appealed to critical and self-critical awareness, highlighting questions on how to exist outside the cultural industry and stand up to the consumerist society. Āboliņš applied this reflection also to art. If in his manifesto of Fluxus Festival of New Art in 1964, he enthusiastically wrote that the greatest happening, the richest, the collage, the most active action is life, seeing that Fluxus art can embody it. In early 70s, in one of his letters, he commented that unfortunately Fluxus art has lost its emancipatory character. And in his notes, he declared that under capitalism, art is transformed into design, which essentially means producing commodities, not art. Art and design turns into product image making. The art market concerns itself with turning non-commodities into commodities. And after the political art of the 60s and artistic politics of the 70s, now the time has come to the educational value of art, as he wrote. Also, contemporary art Āboliņš viewed now with rather critical eye, observing that in early 70s, the most advanced Western avant-garde that gets at the top of the art market are gags and practical jokes. He was still interested in the newest art forms. Nevertheless, his priorities clearly had shifted to the art of politics, and in one of his letters he was reflecting that conceptualists are simply wasting their time, yet the most impressive concept I know is Marx Engels' Gesamtausgabe. Āboliņš tried to put his theoretical beliefs to practice in his cultural relations with Latvia. In 1973, he traveled to Riga to agree on mounting an exhibition entitled 20 Realists from Soviet Latvia in Düsseldorf as part of the Art and Information Fair, Jaký. It was a unique opportunity to show Latvian art in an international context. He also visited Latvia in 1975 and 1977 as part of promoting painter Maija Tabaka for the German academic exchange via their residency. Here's some works from the artist. He was also planning the retrospective of Gustav Klutzis in West Berlin. In fostering cultural relations, he also collaborated with He also collaborated with official institutions, yet he maintained more lasting relations through mail art letters to Latvian friends from the milieu of art, music, and literature, supplementing these with all kinds of publications containing information about current trends in cultural life in the West. His eccentric and densely informative and also witty letters now is an important source both of his own creative activities and of cultural processes in the West and exile, and also about ties with Latvia. Abolish published also a number of polemical articles in exile press, yet the most important source to understand his ideas and their development are his letters. The contents varied from quotidian bulletins about every day to an analysis of the ideological context of culture and politics, as well as passages on art, music, literature, cinema, politics, and history, bringing also to unusual reading experience. Many of his letters are also splendid mail art or correspondence art, which was in keeping with the untamed spirit of Fluxus. Mail artists used the correspondence not only for communication, but also as a channel for their creativity and global network in which each tried to be wittier than others. While this Abolinch was not interested in the official mail art networks and exchanges between unknown addresses, which underpinned much of mail art community activities, for him an exchange of thoughts and opinions was paramount, and it created his own network. Through his letters, Valdis Abolinch also formed his most permanent links with Latvia by corresponding with friends he had made during his trips to Riga. He wrote enthusiastically about exhibitions, concerts, and films in the West, and discussed literature and art with equal passion in Latvia with equal passion. Through his letters, Abolinch wanted to develop an exchange of opinions that would combine a subjective view on cultural processes with rational analysis, the latter still fueled with dialectics of socialism and defeating capitalism from the vantage point of a Western leftist intellectual. In 1975, Abolinch moved to West Berlin to take up the post of the head of the executive secretary of the Neue Gesellschaft für Bildende Kunst, or NGBK, an organization based on the principles of democratic and non-hierarchical administration demanded by the new left of the West. The NGBK shows emphasized politically critical art that contrasted with the modernism dominating elsewhere. The spotlight was on constructivism, workers and revolutionary movements, global and feminist art. As the head of the institution, Valdis Abolinch could not work as a curator. Nevertheless, he often was a member or leader of working groups. His biggest contribution was the work on Realism Studio, where he promoted discussions and indirectly influenced the conceptions of exhibitions. His exile's vantage point may have helped to strengthen the emphasis on the non-Western perspective, typical for NGBK exhibition policy, even before the rise of post-colonial studies. Valdis Abolinch died in 1984 without having witnessed the change in the political climate and the end of Cold War, the fall of Berlin Wall and restoration of Latvian independence. Yet his impact on the political and cultural politics lasted beyond his death, and it was just as avant-gardist as during his lifetime, fostering art relations in the new geopolitical context. The most telling example of this was the exhibition Riga Lettische Avantgarde in West Berlin, and also Bremen and Cologne in 1988 and 1989, as well as other exhibitions of Latvian artists in Germany and elsewhere in Europe that followed. His example is telling also in context of role culture played in relations between people on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In the Soviet Union, also in Latvia, isolation policy during the Cold War years was very strong, even if the cultural exchanges elsewhere was a common practice. And it also applied to arts. Artists from the region, apart from few exceptions, were not able to establish any international connections and participate in the exhibitions in the West. However, there appeared some cracks in the wall, and Abba Lynch was one of the most seminal figures in the cultural scene who fostered these contacts, both through official and also through private contacts. His example in this context is not simple, and it points to the hybrid nature of the processes. If the goal of the cultural relations of the part of the Soviet Latvian ideologues was to influence the actions and opinions of the exile community, for Valdis Āboliņš it opened up the opportunity to practice his theories on the New Left and to engage and steer the cultural relations and exchanges. His ideas were considered radical by many, both in exile and in Latvia, and he, along with other Marxists and leftists in the West, was criticized for idealizing socialism and thus accepting the totalitarian policies of the Soviet Union. His intentions were the opposite, however. He was driven by an idealistic desire to change political reality through culture. Much of it was realized in his lifetime or also later, opening up isolated worlds through cultural relations and emergence of more international dimensions to artistic cooperations. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Eva for introducing us to the work and thinking of Valdis Āboliņš. And now I would like to welcome Magdalena Želkovská, art historian and curator, who was between 2015 and 2018 a director of the Bunker Sztuki Gallery, a museum for contemporary art in Krakow, and currently is appointed a chief of textile art department in the Central Museum of Textiles in Łódź. Magdalena will talk about Jerzy Ludwiński, a Polish art theorist, and his approach to the art theory in his times.
Hello, welcome everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Tomáš and Teresa for inviting me, and also to Sarah and her team for making all of the technological switches possible. Thank you very much. I'm going to speak about Jerzy Ludwiński and his unique and exceptional practice as an art critic, because as an art critic, he was intensively thinking of an art institution, their structures, missions. He developed their programs, and the aim of my presentation today is to present the evolution of few concepts of the art institution of Jerzy Ludwiński. I'm sure his figure is much less known to international context than Valdis Āboliņš or Jindřich Chalupecký, and his reception and recognition is definitely much different nationally and internationally, and I think this is also one of the points for the future debate. Ludwiński, born on 1930, himself is often described as a critic on a road, in constant motion. It's not difficult to understand that this given mobility of his life spread between cities like Lublin, Warsaw, Wrocław, Toruń, and Poznań. This constant change and nomadism that distinguished his professional practice as an art critic, curator, later on also the professor at the Art Academy, accompanying evolution of artistic forms and structures, characterized of the theory, but also in the space of the reflection that was devoted to the functioning of the institution, the strategies of the gallery, and the center of art. The presentation you will see here is much more related to his life as a critic. It's very difficult to present materials similar to what Eva did just before, and I just would like you to have some shots of his images, photographs, portraits. Ludwiński was not a clerk in a bureaucratic machine. He was far from a consummate politician or strategist, polished in conversation with the local authorities and the ministry. For some of them, his arrival to Wrocław in 1966, and this is the moment when I would like to start, was to introduce a critical ferment that was lacking in the local environment. For others in Wrocław, outsider, creating an envy is his experience and contacts with the leading national art scene. Authorities of the city were aware of the intellectual caliber and artistic influence of Ludwiński because in a secret note, Operational Security Service in 1970, it was reported what following. I'm quoting, Jerzy Ludwiński, a critic, being familiar with all new artistic orientations in the West, he's spokesman of their slogans of on Polish soil. The pseudo-innovators concentrated at the Mona Lisa Gallery officially neglected and negate our values, do not recognize the path to seek and reach national culture, taking the ready recipes of Western theoreticians uncritically under the pretext of the artistic avant-garde, largely unprovable on our grounds and affecting socialist reality. Their goals is to create an artistic elite. They argue that there is quite a whole of conventional art in them, and they try their work irritate with its unusual character, hindered the understanding of artistic phenomena in one way only. This is the long quotation. It means also that Ludwiński was a visionary, and maybe even he was an artist working as a critic. And this feature of him will decide the policy and fate of his own artistic institutions. The title of this presentation, a quite provocative sentence dated from more than 40 years ago, I would like to read as a kind of futuristic harbinger for various models of art institutions that had been declaring their involvement in important present-day issues. I think this is what connects Waldysa-Bolins, Chalupecký, and Ludwiński. Looking for the exhibiting strategies and practices introduced in his theoretical concept of Museum of Current Art, and with this proposal from Autumn 1966, I would like to start, or the Gallery of Mona Lisa, or Center of Artistic Research from 1970. I would like to present the trajectory between the historical reform and formats that existed within the institutional field from the late 1960s, when artists started to use new materials, technologies, reshaped the meaning of the artwork, and Ludwiński's interests for calling for new categories and notions based on the continuous artistic process, also including movements and activities from beyond the immediate field of art, coming from protest and form of oppositions. Let me allow to quote and refer to Miśko Suwakowicz's recognition of particular type of cultural institution characteristic of post-war Central and Eastern Europe. In addition to practices of alternative artists and curators carried out inside official institutions, Suwakowicz, in one of his lectures and text, pointed to practices that take place within and by means of phantom institutions. On one hand, this phantom institution had a strictly fictitious character that allows it to be described as unrealized project, proposal of conceptual nature, or only just the idea. On the other hand, thanks to its recognized construction, the phantom institution mimicked existing facilities, their forms and protocols. The phantom institution constituted a reality presence and absence. I will treat then the project of Museum of Current Art as this and its subsequent incarnations I just mentioned in the Gallery of Mona Lisa or in Center of Artistic Research, not only as inspiration for multi-faced reflection on museology, on functioning and political enlargements of art institutions in the Polish Republic, People's Republic, but also as a matrix for consistent actions of Ludwiński that were run from the second half of 60s. The fundamental role in the establishment of the Museum of Current Art concept played the symposium Art in a Changing World that took place in Puławy in August 1966. Through the interpenetration and interception of concepts, ideas, and practices that took place in the shadow of the huge monumental azote chimneys and the meeting of artists, scientists, theoreticians, were created the framework for Museum of Current Art, where they all were looking for new forms of participation. Already the guidelines for the symposium, this is the image from one of the debates. In the middle you see Ryszard Stanisławski, that this year was appointed as the director of Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, and Jerzy Ludwiński is the person sitting on his right. Ludwiński, together with Stanisławski, were the commissioners of this symposium. And already in the program guidelines, one of your similarities, as well as several literal repetition in relation to the program of the museum that will be formed officially a few weeks later. As a forerunner of the museum, we can also consider the lecture Ludwiński gave in the symposium entitled New Trends in Polish Art, devoted to the condition of exhibition institutions and the incompatibility of their structure with the nature of recent art. I'm quoting, "Usually, everything that has the least conventional, least standard character runs through these small exhibition premises. Here, above all, new phenomena should be sought. Here, the principle of mediocrity ceases to apply." The program of the Museum of Current Art in Wrocław was created by Ludwiński in autumn 1966, and I believe that it functions as an institution and the model also, or even we can say a prototype at the same time. The fiction of communism reality stretched from following forecasted party guidelines determining economic growth to creating a structure of phantom jobs in the cultural center, which all masked real activities or their complete absence. As an example, I can mention a fictitious job that Ludwiński had as a clerk in the Department of Culture of the city in Wrocław, which was a kind of a pretext for bringing him from Lublin to Wrocław. Even his wife, Eva Ludwińska, has no information on the topic. What was this job based on? What were his duties? Conscious of the motivation of local authorities, which were a fusion of politics and ideology, Ludwiński, the theoretician, used the gesture of free distribution of concepts and ideas that were characteristic of the activities of artists in the late 60s, associated with the male art. In various programs, not only in the museum program, but also in the Mona Lisa Gallery or Center of Artistic Research, he was looking for models of alternative art networks and partisan strategies that corresponded to the real needs of the moment. Admittedly, the choice of such a method of dissemination was dictated by pragmatic premises, but both this and the later strategies of Ludwiński as a curator correspond with the activities, for instance, of Sef Siegelaub or Lucy Lippert, who undertook at the same time. Let me come back to the text called The General Concept of Museum of Contemporary Current Art in Wrocław, which is Ludwiński's first text devoted strictly to institutional theory. It's 10 pages of standard typescript, long, and consists of 5 parts: introduction, acts justifying the creation of the museum, characteristic of the new institution, description of departments, and preparatory works planned for the period of the upcoming 2 years. I'm quoting, "In the whole of Poland, there is no museum of modern art." These words open the text as a direct and decisive critic of the state of the culture in 1966. In the next sentence, however, these are one of the chimneys of azote plant in Puławy with the work of Andrzej Pawłowski in the front. Here is also one image from the symposium with Włodzimierz Borowski performance, photographed all of them by Eustachy Kossakowski. And this is one of Ludwiński's drawing presenting the theory. I will speak about it later. In the next sentence, however, the author adds, however, many museums, and especially the Museum Sztuki in Łódź, have departments of contemporary or modern art. The theoretical foundation of these departments and their contents are not able to fulfill either the social need Polish art attracts from abroad. End of the quote. Paradoxically, Ludwiński does not mention the function of the museum he planned on the domestic soil, where memory and history were subjected to fetishization and mythologization by the cultural policy of the state, even in the late 60s. The general concept was first published in the end of 66. A year later, it was quoted in one of the bulletins. It's also mentioned in the chronicle of the occasion of the Artist Union Congress, and that's it. Of the letters and transcripts of the meetings between Ludwiński and representatives of the authorities, or decisions defining the organizational framework of the planned institution, as well as its very semi-official character of the preparation, have forced so far art historians to underline the conceptual character of the museum. They call it conceptual matrix or impossible museum, and the author's failure was often treated as a micro-utopia drawn on a cafe napkin. I especially very much like the last comparison. Finally, it was made ridiculous in confrontation with the serious educational and propaganda directions issued in the Western and Northern territories. However, this is not a very accurate diagnosis, I believe, because the concept of the Museum of Current Art grew out of the realities of moving art centers, which in a given place and time were established through numerous symposia, conventions, open airs, and festivals in the Poland of the time. Its character was also close to artistic research made in the Wrocław environment, which since the middle 50s was one of the most diverse artistically cities in comparison to the others in the People's Republic of Poland. Probably the political establishment was shocked by its form, novelty, its different way of thinking about the art institution, which was unlike any other concepts of historical or national museums of that time. Ludwiński's proposal questioned the institution of the museum as a historical formation, founded upon a collection and a narrativity based on description and of its aesthetical canon. It was also questioning the idea of national identity. The text can also give the impression of a balanced and thoughtful statement, rich in original metaphors and carefully prepared instruction. The author combines distance and impersonal narrative with the everyday language. Through the text, Ludwiński created a multi-layered and multi-dimensional message. The authorities applauded the linguistic correctness of the ideological premises and policy guidelines. On the other hand, the description of the artistic environment and the museum of play opened up the possibilities of a different future. Ludwiński also treats the term museum very conventionally, and the concept is semantically open enough to be connotes with the artistic atelier, interdisciplinary studio, scientific laboratory, and in the next years also with the concept of the center. Accepting this unusual name within the Polish museum landscape, it allowed Ludwiński to open up a direction toward the unforeseen future. Consequently, its essence was based on the reversed logic captured in the text while using a dichotomy. Close to the architectural radicalism of Oskar Hansen Museum of Contemporary contemporary art from the same year, 1966. MCA recited all actions, was open to non-aesthetic context, and assumed the arrangement of artistic action undermining the stability of the institutions and eliminating predicatability. Speculation about the timelines and future of art was superior to meticulous research into its past. Curiosity and doubt replaced the infallibility and unwavering certainty of the canon. Openness to novelty, challenge, and otherness took the place of stagnation and tradition. In the area of historical categories, Ludwiński's own concepts refer to the new change space of artistic practices. It was the field of the play. He proposed, having in mind a platform of ideas and reflections directed towards the devoted to art created at the given time and catching the most interesting phenomena. Therefore, MCA was supposed to treat contemporary visual art as being subject to constant changes. Its constituent elements have become new categories, degrading the physical coherence of the work of art, not subject to museification. In its place comes posture, gesture, creative process, artistic fact, and the concept. This first manifestation of the museum was called Plebiscite Exhibition and was organized in April 1967 in the Gothic halls of the Wrocław City Hall. It left no illusion in the local environment and among also artists and officials to the scale of the program originality and understanding of the critical foundation of the playing field. Ludwiński invited not only artists to this exhibition, but he invited 3 major galleries representing artistic milieus in Warsaw. It was Foxhall, Kraków, Krzysztofory, and Wrocław. Artists associated later with Mona Lisa Gallery. With this gesture, he supported not only these particular institutions, but also other widely understood as unofficial galleries. It's in them, in contrast to the official showrooms, bureaus of artistic exhibition, clubs, common rooms, cultural centers, that the most untending exhibition movement was focused, the most unconventional and risky work was created, new content in art was born. This is the beginning of the Mona Lisa Gallery, because the Museum of Current Art became a matrix for further actions. Mona Lisa Gallery was a glazed hall of 30 square meters belonging to the International Press and Book Club in Wrocław. The construction of the gallery, its physical space, and the adopted strategies of actions exploded the existing scheme of institutional structure with its rules, hierarchies, canons, modes of exhibiting, rituals cultivated by official politics. The short period when Mona Lisa Gallery was a testing ground of new tendencies and artist attitudes happens between 67 and 71, when it played a crucial role of an hyphen connecting the traditional concept of the work of art of the late 60s and its new definition proposed by Ludwiński in his texts such as Art in a Post-Artistic Age, Neutralization of Criteria, The Zone Free from Convention, or Unidentified Art from early 70s. The gallery condition as a modernist laboratory enabled a development of some of the propositions of the Museum of Current Art and allowed emerging changes to be visible together with their origin in the tradition. The new condition of art, the situation as a term and notion itself, became a significant agent. By taking account of the situation, the gallery was able to equalize theoretical statements with artistic practice, as well as the exhibition of works of art with the distribution of information. I think I'm very close to the moment of the break. That's why I'm afraid we need to stop at this moment. And I'm going to present few more images from the permanent display of the archive of Jerzy Ludwiński and the Museum Contemporary Wrocław. And I think because of the time, I didn't receive any notification that I should finish, but I think this, so far, describing Museum of Current Art and Gallery of Mona Lisa, I can present this kind of unique and individual approach as an art critic to thinking of the development of the gallery or institution dedicated to new phenomenon and emerging artistic practices that was so characteristic to Jerzy Ludwiński, that and he who was a very spontaneous man. He was a spontaneous critic. He was the critic that mostly gave lectures, made notes as this one, who prefer workshop and non-academic environments of free exchange of thoughts with his students than elaborated texts presented on official lectures and in official situation. Therefore, probably Ludwiński was never perceived as Chalupecký was, a spokesman for Polish art abroad. He did not write for international newspapers. He hardly could travel. As far as I believe, I know from his archive documents, he was once at Documenta in the 90s. His drawings that present his theory were very provocative. As you can see, they are full of structures, forms, based on the idea of the development and evolution. And in the same way as he was thinking of the development of evolution in art field, he was transforming this into the space of the institution that should be dedicated to catch the most recent innovative phenomena and to be their kind of seismographs or catalysts or sensitive shelters that will take care of them. Thank you very much so far, and I believe we also have a lot of things in common to discuss during the panel discussion at the end.
Magda, thank you very much. I believe that having Jindřich Chalupecký in this context of those two other figures is a very interesting and enriching part of this symposium. And for now, we will have a little break. I'm looking forward to see Magda later on during the discussion, which starts at 4:30. And our break now will last until 3:30. So see you again in 15 minutes. in the word. Now I would like to welcome Zuzana Wagner-Horvatovičová, an art historian and curator of the modern and contemporary art collection in the National Gallery in Prague. Zuzana will speak about Jindřich Chalupecký and his relations with Italy.
Good afternoon. I'm Zuzana Wagner-Horvatovičová, and my presentation is devoted to a part of my doctoral research into the relations between Italy and Czechoslovakia in the 60s and 70s. I have found catalogs and correspondence of Jindřich Chalupecký with the Italian gallerist Arturo Schwarz in their archives in Prague and in Italy. In particular, the lecture focuses on the correspondence between Jindřich Chalupecký and Arturo Schwarz from 1968 until 1974. The first part of my presentation, it is divided into three parts, focusing on three cities: Prague, Rome, Milan. The first part comments on correspondence of the art and literary theorist and critic Jindřich Chalupecký with the Italian writer, critic, art and gallerist Arturo Schwarz, and on the Italian exhibition curated at the Václav Špála Gallery in Prague. The second part is devoted to the correspondence with the Italian art historian Giulio Carlo Argan and Palma Bucarelli, the director of the National Gallery of Modern Art, NGAM, in Rome. The third part is dedicated to Czech exhibition organized by Chalupecký at Arturo Schwarz Gallery in Milan. In the correspondence in 1968, Chalupecký discussed with Arturo Schwarz arrangements and preparation for Duchamp's exhibition year after for an exhibition of the Italian painter Enrico Bai in Prague. After 1964, Chalupecký became the artistic director of Spala Gallery and started organizing avant-garde international exhibition. The art critic was also one of a few admirators of Marcel Duchamp in Prague, thanks to his contact and trip to Paris in the 1967. The retrospective of Marcel Duchamp has been postponed for almost a year. After August 1968, Schwarz wanted to abandon the preparation for Duchamp's exhibition due to the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia, which he considered inadmissible, but then he changed his mind and the exhibition was inaugurated in March 1969. Exists the letter, the correspondence about this situation. The gallerist Arturo Schwarz is the biggest collector of artworks by Marcel Duchamp in Italy. He loaned a part of his private collection of French artists and also of Italian painters to the exhibition at Václav Špála Gallery in 1969. You can show some picture about this exhibition called Marcel Duchamp at Špála Gallery. At the beginning, this exhibition must be exhibition, but in 1968 Duchamp died, so became the retrospective. At Špála Gallery was exhibited many of artists' installations, so-called ready-mades, and studies for the great glass you can see in the picture. All works borrowed from Arturo Schwarz Gallery. In 1964, Schwarz obtained Duchamp's consent to reproduce his ready-mades and to exhibit and sell them. So in the Prague retrospective, the following works were on display, like bicycle, fontaine, hat hanger, you can see. and other assemblage, photos, drawings, vessels with object, documents, and so on. In the same year, in '69, was opened also a solo exhibition of Duchamp at the Arturo Schwarz Gallery in Milan. The show was called Lovers 9 Etchings by Marcel Duchamp. The second exhibition organized by Chalupecký with the Arturo Schwarz was Enrico Bai, and you can see the catalog. Enrico Bai participated in exhibition at the Hercule de Paris and was the founder of nuclear painting in 1952 when he published the Manifesto della pittura nucleare in Brussels. It's very interesting, for example, as in 1956, Enrico Bai participated to International Congress of Letters and Situationists in Alba, in Italy, with Aspergiorn and Pinot Galizio. And in the same year arrived to Alba also the Czech artist Radulus Jankotík, and the connection you can see in the book Srovnávací studie by Pospiszyl. So Enrico Bai was known in the Czech context before this exhibition. At the Spala Gallery in Prague, the theme of exhibition is devoted to generals and military officers, approximately 27 works created between 61 and 65 were presented in Prague as General Triumpher, a general under ordering the battle, and the officer, and so on. The article Směšné přízraky, Ridiculous Ghost, by Lukáš Hlaváček, wrote the positive text about this exhibition, and the artwork of Enrico Bai was paragonated to grotesque figure, and the method of creating this painting was paragonated with the method of collage and assemblage. Other exhibition, very important, was in '69 in Rome. It was very important institutional exhibition, so-called contemporary art in Czechoslovakia. Because Chalupecký focuses on Rome and begins a correspondence with the art historian Giulio Calargan. Giulio Calargan was the university professor in Rome, and in '76 became a senator with the social democratic part of the government. So he was very important figure in not only in Rome, but in all Italy, and he was very important historian art, published a lot of essays and books about Italian art and also international. Jindřich Chalupecký focuses on a correspondence also with the director of National Gallery of Modern Art in Rome, Palma Bucarelli, and thanks to his contacts, Chalupecký inaugurated an important collective exhibition called Contemporary Art in Czechoslovakia. The context of Chalupecký started in '66 when Chalupecký comes into contact with Argan and Bucarelli thanks to the participation in the meetings of International Association AICA in Bratislava and Prague. Maybe enter in contact with Argan and enter in contact with Palma Bucarelli maybe in '68 in the conference on Czechoslovakia art and AICA association in Brussels. The collective exposition Contemporary Art in Czechoslovakia was in the same time a retrospective and a contemporary art exhibition. It was divided into parties, and participated a lot of important artists like Kupa Pressing, Fila Procházka, Kubishta, and so on. And it was very official event. The opening ceremony was followed by a press conference chaired by Bucarelli, Argan, and Chalupecký. Among the guests were diplomatic Jiří Pelikan, who became an advisor to the Czechoslovak embassy in Rome in '68. In the '68, when the Jiří Pelikan must emigrated from Prague to Rome, he decided to open the second redaction of the newspaper Listy in Rome, and this redaction was active for all 60 years when in the Prague the literary magazine Listy was closed. In the contemporary art in Czechoslovakia was present and invited also the young artists Kolář, Kolibal, Jankovič, Dobeš, and Filko. And in the opening were present also the university professor Angelo Maria Ripellino with the Roman painters Achille Perilli and Antonio Sanfilippo from group Forma Uno. The exhibition included a historical retrospective of the pioneers of the first Czech and Slovak avant-garde, the abstract painters Kupka and Pressing, the cubists Fila and Kubishta, and as well the surrealists Toyen and Janoušek. The second part of the exhibition was dedicated to 17 artists and was called Contemporary Czech and Slovak Art. The exhibition has been a great successful, and many articles has been published in Rome. For example, look at you can see the article by Leonello Ponente, and with the photographs of the artworks of Procházka and Kolibal, and here we have the other article with the photos of artworks of Nemes, Jankovič, Kupka, Procházka, and Fila. After these events, Chalupecký concentrated the art curator activities in Milan, and in the collaboration with the Schwarz organized 4 Czech exhibitions devoted to Jiří Balcar, František Janoušek, Jiří Kolář, and Ladislav Novák in the private gallery Arturo Schwarz in Milan. It was very interesting, for example, about František Janoušek. You can see the cover of the catalog. And it was a great event. In Arturo Schwarz gallery was exhibited oil painting such wind landscape, sculpture, Spanish walls landscape with snakes. You can see a landscape with snakes and Spain walls and the sculpture. About this exhibition, Chalupecký in the catalog explain how the journey of Czech artist to Siena caused a departure from Cubism, and thus a new visual phase became with the debating landscape with a book, exhibited at Schwarz Gallery. Janoušek's artwork was influenced by Italian culture, and it was an offer to emphasize this aspect during the Milan exhibition. The particularity is it's not so much known today about the rich collection of Janoušek in Italy. But the painting, the sculpture was exhibited at the Schwarz Gallery in Milan, and after in 1974, Schwarz dedicated it to the National Museum of Modern Art in Jerusalem in Israel. Other exhibition was dedicated about the Jiří Balzar, and Jiří Balzar was known in Italy because exhibited in Biennale in San Marino in 1965 and in the group graphics exhibition in Rome and Cremona. You can see the catalog with some artworks like What Are You Talking About, My Big Weekend Couple. The other exhibition, very important in Schwarz Gallery, was dedicated to Jiří Kolář, and the exhibition was called Jiří Kolář as a Form of Freedom. The text of the catalog was translated in 3 languages and participated by the text of Chalupecký, Vladimír Burda, and Jiří Kolář. We can see the, for example, the collage like the mysterious chateau of the Carpathians and butterfly of Slovakia. It was the big event in these exhibitions. Was not only collage but also the object, and the critic was very positive. After we have the Untitled exhibition, so-called heretical surrealism of Ladislav Novák, for example, the Cyclus of Roses or Passion, Invocation and Poems, and the article. And in the catalog was written by Chalupecký, and he emphasized the close relationship between Novák's first written text and the surrealist ones by André Breton. It was very important because the passion for the Dadaism and surrealism of Arturo Schwarz. He was a very big collector of surrealistic artworks. Was the same for the Jindřich Chalupecký. I want just add the important role of Chalupecký as art critic. When in the Chalupecký correspondence describes not only the organization of exhibition in art gallery, but also the cultural and political situation at the turning points after August 68. It testifies to the development of Prague Spring, which helped to expand the new network of contacts between Czech and Italian artists and critics. At the same time, it shows how quickly the normalization changed cultural conditions and limited Czech art exhibition abroad. So Chalupecký tried to make arrangement in Italy for publishing essays about Czechoslovak contemporary art and politics. Arturo Schwarz responded by publishing articles in Italy by Chalupecký on Czech art, and helped to find publishers and contact interested in issuing Chalupecký text. And we have some examples like the article in the Italian magazines Flash Art, Data and NAC. The similar, and I finish my presentation, was the role of critic art Arsen Pohrybny. he is one of the founders of Czech Club of Concretists. And he immigrated after 68 in temporary, before to North Italy and after to West Germany. And in 60s and until 70s, he organized a series of traveling exhibitions dedicated to the Club of Concretists and to the Czech graphic works. For example, Club Concretisto here, the catalog from Gallery Numero in Florence and so on. And it's important because also in Czechoslovakia in 68, the Club of Concretists with Pohrebny invited Italian artists as Achille Perilli, Piero Dorace, Gianni Colombo to participate in their exhibition at Vysocina Gallery in Jihlava. So if you see the very long bibliography, we have a lot of articles by Pohrebny and also by Chalupecký publicated in Italy, and a lot of catalogs who testimonied how the activity as art curator was very, very large in Italy in the 60s. In conclusion, Chalupecký and Pohrebny, for me, play an important role as art critics and art curators because they included Czech art scene into broader European context through exhibition and confrontation with artists of other nationalities during and after the Prague Spring. Thank you very much for attention.
Thanks very much to Zuzana for taking us to Italy, at least briefly. And now we will move to Russia with Chalupecký. I would like to welcome Tomáš Glanz in distance. Tomáš is a Russian studies scholar, translator, and semioticist, and he teaches at the Zurich University. Je problém u něj nebo u nás? Tak omlouváme se za technický problém a právě to řešíme a doufám, že během chvilky se nám podaří získat zvukové spojení s Tomášem Glancem, tak nám prosím dejte malý okamžik ještě.
And in this case, he was a prominent speaker of this also skepticism concerning the situation of a contemporary artist in the West. We already did here today about his statement about his belief that unofficial artists or some semi-official artists in Czechoslovakia are working actually in a free space, independently concerning institutions, and so his view on this East-West transfer of knowledge, of influences, and comparative analysis of situation was never dichotomic, but always interested in more complicated kind of pro et contra analysis. So the program was based on this belief that Soviet artists and Czechoslovakian artists are in a similar situation, and it's also what Chuikov wrote in this statement many years later, remembering his trip to Czechoslovakia, which was the first one. Later on, Vladimir Jankilevsky, Ilya Kabakov, Viktor Pivovarov, and many other came to participate in this program, which Milena Slavická, who did at that time a young art historian, who did help Chalupecký organizing these visits, did describe quite in details in Networking, the blog published and edited by Klára Kempfers, the book I already did mention. Chuikov wrote that the organization was just perfect, and we can add it was authoritarian kind of program when Soviet artists did have an absolutely exact schedule of their visits and also very careful schedule inclusively lunch policy. Chuikov wrote that everything was planned into smallest details. Chalupecký always did know even which Czech artists can offer a lunch to his visit from Soviet Union. And in his memory, Stanislav Kolíbal, Magdalena Jetelová, Eva Kmentová did play a major role, but at the same time he is mentioning many others, people who did present their work to Chuikov, and after Chuikov to many other artists, and vice versa. And the interesting moment of this exchange and of this communication, which took part both in Soviet Union and in Czechoslovakia, it's the outcome, which was not a kind of enthusiastic networking as we could maybe imagine, but mostly indifference, disinterest, and sometimes even aversion. The Czech art was, for Chuikov and for many other Russian artists from this circle, Chuikov wrote, too secure, too cultivated, too chamber character. And Russian works, from the perspective of Czech recipients, have been perceived as too straightforward, too rough, too American style. It's a nice word for those who understand Russian, Amerikanism. It's not American, but as Americans, maybe in also imagination of recipient. Much better was the situation, interestingly enough, was much better the situation in Slovakia. So Chuikov did show not only his own works, but also, for example, works by Erich Bulatov, as he did mention in the letter, who was also understood in this style described above. So what we can see here is, interestingly enough, the situation in the Slovakia and Bratislava were much better. What the understanding from the point of understanding each other. We can think in this perspective about a strong tradition of Slovak conceptualism and about differences between Czech and Slovak situation, which through Chalupecký and through even indirectly through his communication with Russian artists, we can get maybe a new, more sharp view on differences between artistic situation in Slovakia and Czech part of Czechoslovakia during 70s and 80s, which was quite obvious from guests from Soviet Union. So misunderstanding, disappointment, lack of enthusiastic contacts and friendships, and at the same time this moment of comparative issue. Čujkov wrote artists in Czechoslovakia were much less in isolation than we have been in Soviet Union, and it was one reason why for me and for other participants of this exchange program initiated by Chalupecký, these trips have been first chance, first occasion, first possibility to be confronted with a live contemporary art. Maybe you remember, I didn't read it from the slide, but maybe you remember in the first letter I mentioned, Čujkov wrote about analogy about his own work with fragments as a special significant phenomenon of his artistic vocabulary, and something he found in the journal Chalupecký did send him in the group of Californian artists. It was this kind of transfer of influences. In Czechoslovakia, the experience was a different one. It was a live meeting, a live exchange, a live discussion, and sometimes also discussion which was confrontative. And nevertheless, Čujkov wrote, it is not possible to overestimate this possibility and this achievement which Chalupecký did through his activities and through this program, which became in Soviet Union when Chalupecký came without any knowledge of Russian language. He didn't speak, he didn't read, he didn't understand Russian. The whole mission, the whole transfer was based on translation. And I think translation is a key word in all this process. It was translation not only in the linguistic sense of the word, but translation in many other senses of this strategy. And I think this correspondence and archive, both of Chalupecký and Russian artists, can make us really curious about details of this thrilling story, which took part basically between the second half of 60s and the second half of 80s between Soviet Union, Prague, and many places around the world where Chalupecký did publish his articles about Soviet artists, which in many cases were the very first publications about this young generation of Soviet artists abroad. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks to Tomáš for his contribution, and thanks to the audience for your patience at the beginning. And Tomáš, please stay with us for the further discussion. So we heard a bit about Chalupecký's relations in Italy and in Russia. Of course, Chalupecký's international activities brings much more questions and topics on the table, and we don't have the space here to address everything. For example, Chalupecký's long-term relationships with French artists and curators, etc. So we believe we will have another opportunity or another occasion to discuss these topics. But now I'm happy to give the word to our last speaker, Anežka Bartlová, art writer and critic, and PhD candidate at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, who will conclude our symposium with a more general topic. She will be speaking about Jindřich Chalupecký and art criticism, which I believe is a nice way how to cover up our today's session, because the relationship between art and art writers, critics and theoreticians can be seen as a kind of red thread going through this whole afternoon.
Thank you very much for the word. Right now, a contest for a statue or a memorial for Jindřich Chalupecký and his second wife, Jiřina Hauková, is in process. He is also widely remembered by Jindřich Chalupecký Society, and the fact that Václav Havel visited him on his deathbed helped the legend of Chalupecký as a culturally and politically very important person, so-called, is being preserved, helped to be preserved. He's usually considered one of the most important Czech art critics and curators, but it is not clear what it meant to be an art critic in the 60s in Czechoslovakia. 30 years after his death, it's definitely time to look more closely at the iconic Czech art critic of the 20th century and how he wrote and how. Jindřich Chalupecký began writing on art and literature in his 20s. In a few different rather local periodicals from the 30s, we can find a surprising number of critiques and commentaries. In our work in progress bibliography, I count about 377 items. Not all of them are articles, but still, written before the year 1949. That means in just 18 years. Out of the total items, out of the 600 items in total written before his death in 1989, and another 120 just in the 60s. Since I am not an expert in the interwar period, I will focus here on his post-war critical praxis concentrated in the 60s. The so-called golden 60s in Czechoslovakia were a time of establishing of post-Stalinist critique. In its first and second wave, there were discussions on topics such as realism versus abstraction and its impact on the viewer, dogmatism in art versus clear criteria needed for art criticism, and last but not least, the discussion on how to gain and distribute awareness of international art for critics themselves, for artists, and for the public. Journalism and media, in a broader sense, were in the 1960s considered a very important pillar of the state propaganda as well. Art was referred in official reference of cultural workers as educational tool for masses. To get a clear idea of Chalupecký's own view on theory of art criticism, we can look to a few texts which are what I call meta-criticism. In these rather short texts, Chalupecký aims to answer the question of what art criticism is and what is it good for, or more precisely, what the position of art critics is in the relation between art or the art world and the socialist society. We are speaking here about two of the texts by Chalupecký and a short answer to a survey from a culture magazine. The chronically first of these texts is titled Defense of Art Criticism, originally Obhajoba kritiky, and was written and published in 1964 in the art magazine Výtvarná práce, as a response to a document by the Central Committee of the Union of Czechoslovak Artists, published shortly before in the same magazine. In the document meant as a pre-meeting discussion, the Central Committee accused art criticism of being a huge part of the problem in arts propaganda problem, particularly in the fulfillment of ideological aims dictated by the Ministry of Culture and Education and the Communist Party. Chalupecký, more sharply than two other art critics writing to the same subject, criticized the structures of the Union and its non-existent support for theoreticians and art critics. Alongside this, he offered his thoughts on the question, what is art criticism? According to Chalupecký, the main misconception arises from the two assumptions which he saw behind the criticism come from the Central Committee. One is this assumption that art criticism should show the way forward for the development of art to artists and the take position of a judge advising which path to follow and which artworks should be left behind. A result of this assumption would be that art criticism should serve as a mediator to the public and recommend it to the people what they should like. This, Chalupecký assumes, is based on the belief that art critics know more than others, whether artists or the public, to whom they should show the correct way. The second assumption, due to a mistake in the way art criticism is being thought about, is the idea that the development of art or of beauty itself could be subject of a scientific discipline. The assumption that art is somehow specialized activity distanced from all others, and the artists are a specialist in bringing beauty into ordinary life, that art criticism should be able to judge how much beauty there is in each artwork. Chalupecký warns against such a conclusion, since he continues to be able to react and enjoy the new in which comes in art. The most essential skill is to be open towards the new. This is what Chalupecký called disponibility or availability, let's call it, towards art. And this, Chalupecký argues, is often in direct opposition to the approach gained by education in art history, since the development of art forms seems logical only in hindsight. Art criticism, he concluded, is an epistemological process, I quote, long-lasting and difficult, end of quote. And the result, the text itself, should not be a judgment, but more a formulation of open, unresolved problems in art. Art criticism should not be normative, but instead should show, it's a quotation, show the pathway through life, end of quotation. In the second text, called The Ways of Art Criticism, Cesty kritiky, presented at the ICA Congress in Prague in September 1966, Chalupecký argues that art criticism is a type of philosophical discipline. This is because it looks for the essence of art, not anything material or materialized, but, I quote, a question, what essential could art open to me? End of quotation. At the same time, he warns, once again, against the idea that art criticism is expertise or some highly specialized activity. I quote, art criticism does not lay in unbiased expertise. On the contrary, art criticism is always engaged. End of quotation. This engagement he understands as a reaction to a formulation of the problems of contemporary development in art, not in a political way, not in a direct political way. The main task for an art critic is to differentiate between non-art and true art. For him, this means identifying artworks reacting and developing impulses from everyday life through an artistic way of thinking and practice, rather than creating formalistic plays. His third notion on how art criticism works comes in Chalupecký's answer to a survey from critical culture magazine Orientace in 1967. On the question of the relation of subjective and objective artistic or scientific strategies in art criticism, Chalupecký answered by emphasizing the importance of experience. I quote, "My experience with art is only good for learning that I am uneducated." End of quotation. This unlearning moment leads to the situation when art critics, I quote, "stay uneducated as well as inexperienced forever." End of quotation. In order to be able to tell the story of art. This story would be the artwork at the same time as it would belong to the art critic themselves. This highly pathetic formulation is typical for Jindřich Chalupecký, directly connecting his critical practice to writing as an artist, more art historians, when he wrote artist profiles, as a story of. But to what extent did Chalupecký apply his theories of the praxis of art critics' work to his own criticism? Although the quality of art writing by Jindřich Chalupecký is impressive, quantity, of course, although the quantity of art writing by Jindřich Chalupecký is impressive, there are not so many reviews. There are reviews, mostly from the period 1964 till 1970, and are not very informative, and we are often left unsure what the exhibition looked like, since the descriptive mode is mostly missing. What we get instead is a very wide overview on contemporary art in the West and art history back to Mannerism, which was popular at the time. An illustrative example of the review of this type of the exhibition of Soviet art is the review of exhibition of Soviet art at Manege Gallery in Moscow, which he attended on occasion of the official visit of Moscow in 1965. Since the visit was officially organized by the Union of Soviet Artists to coordinate the future symposium with their Czechoslovak colleagues, the content is surprising, especially since Chalupecký published his review in Výtvarná práce, therefore the official art magazine of Czechoslovak Union of Artists. Chalupecký begins by clearly stating that the model of Czechoslovak art is mainly Western art, not Soviet one. I quote, "At the Salon de Mai in Paris, we feel home-like. In Moscow, at Sovietskaya Rossiya exhibition, we feel foreign." End of quotation. Then he goes on to criticize alienation of Western art from people, while on the other hand, exhibitions in Moscow were massively attended. What follows is a long digression to the history of viewers in interest of and the popularity of art through history, from Impressionism to pop art. Chalupecký also quotes from a very critical article from American art magazine called Location on how the art market bans art production. Finally, he ends his text with a long excursus on prehistoric situation and the question of whether people in the Paleolithic era needed and appreciated art. Afterwards, Chalupecký imagines what the future of art looks like. There is a sci-fi vision where we created perfect cyborgs or robots who do not need art since they do not think as we do. Clearly, Chalupecký wrote that what he wanted, no matter the actual exhibition. In this resistance, there is only a little aspect of political reaction. He would probably argue that the most important aspects for him is quality of exhibited artworks. Another example of a review of a foreign exhibition is the three-part review of Paris autumn shows from the year 1964. Here, Chalupecký provides an overview and explanation and the context for contemporary art tendencies such as pop art, neorealism, abstraction, and so-called kinetic art. Through this, Chalupecký introduced to his readers contemporary intellectuals and art critics from France and the United States or Italy, the main centers of contemporary art of the 1960s. In fact, Chalupecký wrote mainly about foreign exhibitions in Paris, Moscow, or across West Germany. On the basis of a range of shows, rather than large ones, he formulated interpretations of contemporary art tendencies. Throughout his reviews, there are almost no comments about contemporary art exhibition in Czechoslovakia, and just a few notes on the artists included in the international shows like Biennial of the Young, or the Salon of Young Sculptors in Paris in 1964. In his text, there is often a repeated discussion of academicism as something to be wary of. Tendencies towards the comfort of academicism, not risking anything and being follower of trends, is for Chalupecký one of the clearly formulated characteristics of non-art. In contrast, the most valued art gained the label modern art, which is mostly connected to the questioning what modern life actually is. Chalupecký proposed realism as a special mode, which does not necessarily mean descriptive characteristics, rather it is realism as a connection to reality or actuality. Interesting enough, Chalupecký divided totally political engagement with which he expressed in few but very interesting texts from engagement with the field of art. He confesses to addressing his writing mostly to artists themselves, therefore he insists he published them intentionally in Výtvarná práce and less often in Výtvarné umění, the two main magazines of the time read broadly by artists. And indeed, the characters of these texts, mostly published in 1966 in the book Umění dnes, Art Today, is primarily educational with digressions to prehistoric arts, or let's say informational with the intention of informing artists about the context of contemporary art in ways they will be able to relate to. As Chalupecký often stresses, Czechoslovak artworks were, in his eyes, often relatable to those in the by Western artists. In a commentary in the end of the volume Umění dnes, Art Today, Chalupecký seems to apologize for the boldness of publishing the book, stating that his texts were written for a certain moment, and that, I quote, it was more anti-theory than a theory, end of quotation. By that he means these texts are more or less an attempt to formulate some thoughts, not a final unbreakable theory. He admits that there are many contradictions in these thoughts on modern art, and he would leave it as such, as they have been published in magazines a few years earlier. We can see this anti-theoretizing as a defensive statement against academicism or dogmatism in a vocabulary of the early 1960s. Chalupecký was raised and formed in the 1930s and kept something from interwar period in his expressions. Academicism was for him the real danger for modern art, showing up where there is no risk or real interest in reality in case of artists, or real interest in artworks itself in case of art criticism. Since he loved to debate on different topics, and some of these polemics are published, as a correspondence exchange with artists, for example, with artist Manuel Famíra over representing reality and propagation of abstraction, with Jan Kotík over his own works and originality of the idea, and with Milan Knížák over the beginning and characteristics of the happenings. We are able to reconstruct some truly art-critical moments or texts by Chalupecký. 3 roundtable discussions about notable exhibitions were published in Výtvarná práce, with Chalupecký participating in all of them. In these, we see a different critical style than the Chalupecký displayed in the previously mentioned text. In group discussions, he is a tough critic who judges quality very sharply and typically explains very little about his judgment. As we may now see, Chalupecký tries to build a kind of basis of the art criticism, or rather art writing, as Josef Hlaváček described Chalupecký's praxis in a review of his book on Marcel Duchamp. There is a clear call for empathy, for being with the artwork and letting it speak first, not to ask, but being asked, as Chalupecký wrote. He also speaks about the engagement necessary for art critics, both within and outside the art world. I quote, to be aware of problems of modern art and reality, end of quotation. There are nearly no references to the political aspects of art, its history or institutions, even though Chalupecký promotes art as a powerful tool necessary for developing of socialist society. Contradictions one after another, though, as Chalupecký himself claimed, he was aware of this. His book, Art Today, was a record, I quote, a record of not yet strictly formulated thoughts, an unfinished and even unfinishable process, which should tend to settling the terms and thoughts according to my experience, end of quotation. Thus, he explained the approach he named anti-theoretizing. We can conclude at this point that the best characteristic of Chalupecký's critical praxis is that it is an anti-theory. That means he intentionally leaves problems open and try to be personally available to discuss anything, anytime, but at the same moment to be informed enough not to teach necessarily, but to give context as broad as possible. I suggest we can interpret all his fragmentary argumentation, long historical digressions, disturbing incoherence of the outputs and contradictions within the text, unfinished thoughts, and division of political and art topics in his writing, or in other words, this anti-theory as a part of art criticism as he understands it. Art criticism seen as an epistemological process by somebody truly afraid of academicism and interested in contemporary world. Yeah.
Thank you, Aneška, for this very last contribution of our today's symposium. And now it's time to welcome back Tomáš Glanz and Magdalena Žolkovská for the discussion which will be led by Tomáš Pospiszyl.
Good evening. Let me test our connection by asking the first question to Tomáš, to Zurich. I would be just intrigued to know if there is still a trace of Jindřich Chalupecký in Russia. For example, was any of his texts published in Russian, or does he lives only in the memories of those who were part of this informal exchange program you described? We seem to have the same problem with hearing as we did.
Ano. ještě jednou celý znova.
Then
celé
let me
přihlášení do
switch to
toho,
Magda
do mixu.
And try connection with her. I hope she can hear me. And if I would go back to your talk about Ludvínsky.
I hear you well.
And we spent this whole afternoon here talking about Chalupecký and his different projects that involved all these connections between Italy, Russia, France.
Tak, teď zase neslyším nic.
While Ludvínsky seems to be almost uninterested in these type of international connections. He seemed to be very concentrated on local context and building institutions locally, as if, for example, a personal presence seemed to be a very, very valuable thing to him. At least I had this feeling. So why was this dimension missing in his work or in his thinking? Can you explain?
Thank you very much for the question, and let me know if you hear me well, because
so then I will switch and test the connection with those who are present here in Brno. And let me start with Aneška, which in fact you mentioned something that I didn't realize that much, and that is the fact that Chalupecký didn't write so many art reviews later in his life. And if he did, it was about exhibitions that his readers could not see. That this is a very peculiar choice of subjects and themes. Do you have an explanation for that? Like, why do you think he was almost, I would say, avoiding to write about exhibitions that were a hot topic for Czech criticism of its time? Was it a strategy how to make him stand outside as someone who is judging only the general problems of the art world, or was it maybe influenced by his age, that you do this very hands-on criticism only when you are in your 20s and 30s? What do you think?
I wouldn't say that's because of his age, but certainly could play some role. He was about like his 50s at that time, at the 1960s, and I would say he really enjoyed the discussions, and maybe reviews didn't give him enough pleasure to discuss. So I guess, I'm not sure about it, I didn't find any record on this, but I would suggest that he organized these critical tables, or like these discussions, critical tables, let's say, like the discussions among 2 till 5 art critics on one exhibition and on one time, which were also published, and which is really like a strange format for today. Like, we are not doing this in today art criticism. And I would say if he would write today, I guess he will do much more interviews with artists than like really reviews, which is, I'm not sure the real reason, but I would say this.
Thank you. Let me test the connection with Zuzana. We just, when we had the intermission, we came across a very interesting and important information that you shared with me, and that was not part of your presentation. But let me ask you, you mentioned and you showed us the bibliography of texts written for Italian publications by Chalupecký, but you also mentioned that there was a book project in Italy of Jindřich Chalupecký that was not realized. So what was it? When was it? What were the circumstances of this project?
Yes, in years 1972, when was closed 71, the Spala Gallery in Prague, and when Chalupecký cannot organize organizing other exhibition and starting thinking about his book. He wrote to Giulio Argan, and Giulio Argan sent the contact to the editor Paolo Fossati. In this time he was the editor of Einaudi editions. Einaudi editions in 70s in Italy was the bigger edition to publishing the art historian and critic essay dedicated not only about the Italian art but also about the international art. For example, the contemporary art in Spain, contemporary art in French, and so on. And Argan published with this edition Einaudi some books. So Chalupecký wrote to Fossati and asked if can publicate his big essay. And his essay was very similar, like the structure of new art in Czech, Nové umění v Čechách. This book was published in Czech Republic only in 1994, after the death of Chalupecký. So when I read these letters, this correspondence, and confronted the capitals and paragraphs in the books of Chalupecký, New Art in Czech, and these letters, it was and it is very similar. Unfortunately, Paolo Fossati must respond to Chalupecký that the project...
To nevadí.
So we do apologize for technical intermission. We seem to lost Magdalena and Tomáš. They will be not back again. And I also understand that you cannot see us, only hear us. And okay, you can see us, so we have to be more careful. And we will carry on I would like to ask Zuzana to finish her response and continue from where we stopped a few minutes ago.
Thank you. In 1972, Jindřich Chalupecký published the big article in the Italian art magazine Napište, with the editor. The editor was Paolo Fossati, the same editor of Einaudi editions, and it was the big, just one number, all number was dedicated to Czechoslovakian art and also political situation. And in this big number was published not only the article by Chalupecký, but also the article by Arsen Pohřebný. In particular, he wrote about the chronology of art, contemporary Czech art, and participated other Italian and Czech art critic, and it was very important because the interest about the Czech social and cultural and artistic art was big in Italy, and maybe was bigger when closed abroad. And so in Italy, Jindřich Chalupecký cannot publicate his book, but publicated a lot of articles in the NAC, in the art magazine Flash Art, in the Data, in the Domus, and so on. And Arturo Schwarz helped to connect it, the editors of different art magazine when Chalupecký and where Chalupecký can publish his articles.
So let me now ask you both the same question. The role of institutions in the life of Jindřich Chalupecký. When he was backed up by institutions in 1970s, the Artist Union, ICA, in 1960s, excuse me. He could do all these exhibitions, he could do all these exchanges. And it seems as if everything this stopped in 1970s. Was it because he lacked the institutions in his back, or because the time changed?
I would say, if I can start it by this question, I would say one point is that at the 1970 he was retired, which is important. Like I guess it's important because when someone was retired under the socialism in normalization, he or she would have much more broader opportunity to act and to do to travel sometimes if he or she could get the passport, which is another step, but it was much easier for seniors and retired persons. So I would guess this was one point that he then concentrated more on his own writing and the contacts with abroad, with Italy, but also France and all these correspondence networks which you have mentioned previously. And the second is, yes, I would believe that the institutions are important in what could one do, and it helps also the imagination what one can do, and so on, so on. So also the Artist Union, which he was in a board, in the central committee in a certain time, was important, I guess, as how to explain it, like the effect of institution, the effect of being institutionalized is something like, I guess it's really like a backup, as you mentioned, according to my belief.
So what about the case of Italy? Did Chalupecký lose his respect and his possibilities once he didn't have an artist union in his bag? Was he still respected in Italy in 1970s?
Jindřich Chalupecký never lose the respect, because the correspondence, for example, with Arturo Schwarz continued to all life with Chalupecký, and continues the correspondence with the editors from Italian art magazine and so on. The problem was other. First of all, in the 60s, Jindřich Chalupecký was one of commissaries in the Commission of National Gallery in Prague. So, National Gallery Prague was the bigger institution, and the bigger institution had the diplomatic relationship with the Italian institution, for example, with the National Gallery in Prague. So, for example, after the collective exhibition organized by Chalupecký, Contemporary Art in Czechoslovakia in 1969, was organized in National Gallery in Prague, the big solo exhibition of Achille Perilli, the Roman painter, who was presented in Rome. So it was like a little diplomatic change. The second point, with the rapid normalization, closed the Václav Špala Gallery. And Jindřich Chalupecký can organize a lot of exhibition through the Václav Špala Gallery, because it was, yes, public, but a little private, not private gallery, but can organize the exhibition with the private galleries in abroad. When closed the Špala Gallery in Prague, Chalupecký cannot organize this change between the Špala Gallery in Prague and between the Italian private galleries, for example, Arturo Schwarz Gallery. The third point, in 1975, the Arturo Schwarz Gallery in Milan closed. So, when closed the gallery, Chalupecký cannot continue to organize this exhibition in Milan. The third point was political, because in the period of normalization in Czechoslovakia, the diplomatic relationship with the Italy started to be worse, bad. So the Chalupecký cannot collaborate with the institution because Italian institution and Czech institution didn't collaborate together. Chalupecký or not Chalupecký. But in the system of private Italian galleries, the Czech graphic exhibition continues. And for example, in this case, Arsen Pohrybny was the curator of a lot of Czech graphic exhibitions in Italy in 70s. In the same time, Chalupecký, I think, starting to concentrate it to rethink the critic text. I think in 70s, Chalupecký wanted write much more than organize the exhibition. This is my position. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm afraid we run out of time, and I do apologize to those not present here, and thank you very much for your contributions. and for you for organizing this event.
Thank you. Thanks very much to all our speakers, those who are here, those at a distance. Thanks to our production team, my colleagues and technicians. We also would like to thank the Moravian Gallery for hosting us. Thanks to Žilíbena and the National Gallery in Brno for the scene. And of course, thank you very much our viewers for staying with us. We are sorry for the complications at the very end. But if you will be interested to see any of those contributions one more time afterwards, we will publish it soon in a collaboration with Artichoke TV platform. So thank you again and have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Krát